So a very warm welcome to CCLA. My name is Celia Waring and I am one of the Client Relationship Managers here at CCLA. We are delighted to be hosting this Alliance breakfast this morning on solidarity and how philanthropy can help build a shared humanity. And I won't say any more than that because I know, Charles, you're going to introduce the theme and the speakers. It's great to see some clients represented here this morning, so very welcome to you. But for those who don't know CCLA, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about us, and it might make it more clear why we are hosting this morning. So what does CCLA stand for? CCLA stands for Church, Charity and Local Authority. So we are specialist investment managers and we manage investments for church, charity and local authority. We are mutually owned. So we are sort of owned by our clients. So if CCLA does well, then the investors, the charities and churches and local authorities do well as a result. And what that means for the investors is that we are completely, wonderfully uncompromised. So we don't have any other external shareholders trying to draw anything out of the business. We're completely focused on the charities that invest with us. And the third thing, because there are always three things, is that ethical and responsible investment has been a big part of what we do right from when we were founded back in, well, our roots go back to 1958. So that's all I wanted to say. You're all very, very welcome. Thank you for coming, and I'll hand over to Charles to introduce all of our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you, Celia. And the question of investments for foundations is a really important and growing one, and I encourage you to have a look at CCLA's website. And also in the copy of Alliance magazine, we're not talking about the topic today, but there's a long form piece about titled What Happens to the Rest of It, and page 24, how foundations make investments, what are the questions, the decisions, the considerations that foundations should make. And it is a question for another day, but one that we, and I'm sure many of you will be returning to. So thank you, Celia, and thank you very much for having us. I'm Charles Keidan. For those that don't know me, I edit Alliance. I'm really glad to have you here for this Breakfast Club on solidarity. The hashtag we'll be using today is Courage for Solidarity with the number 4, and you'll see it at the top of the programme here. So if you are tweeting, feel free to use that. It's a hashtag that's been used by others in this space as well, so we'll be building on that material. The objective of today's event, in common with all of our breakfast clubs, is to air some of the debates and issues that arise from the special feature of our quarterly magazine. And this one is about solidarity and philanthropy, the complex relationship. And before I introduce the panellists, I just want to say a few words about the special feature. Typically that would be done by our guest editor, but he's not here today, so I'm just going to say a few words about it, and you can all see it here. It's on a copy on your chairs. First of all, it's dedicated to the friends and family of Joe Cox, the social reformer politician who was murdered just 1 week before last year's Brexit referendum. The edition was conceived and published against a growing backdrop of political upheaval in Europe, elections in the UK, France, Holland, and upcoming in Germany, questions of threats to democracy, liberal values, civil society in Poland and Hungary, including the threat to the philanthropically funded higher education institution, Central European University. And some states, citizens and indeed foundations have been more welcoming and have managed the influx of newcomers and refugees. Others have not been as welcoming. I'm sure you've got your views on why that is. Our special feature was guest edited by Stefan Schaffers, the head of European Affairs at the Brussels-based King Baudouin Foundation. And Stefan's central question was to ask about how philanthropy can build a shared humanity if and when solidarity is used in different contexts by different people and for different reasons. So, in effect, complexifying that idea of solidarity rather than just assuming it means solidarity with people who share our views. The feature looked at how philanthropy is responding to the strains between people and states across Europe. It highlights public attitudes to solidarity across the European Union through polling from Chatham House, again funded by European foundations. It looks at foundation associations' responses to far-right populism, including a contribution from Keiran to that. And it also has case studies of how foundations have responded to the refugee crisis, in particular in Germany, where the response has been particularly striking. And there's also questions, really most raised in my interview of Brendan Cox, about framing and language we use when we think about solidarity and how we reach out to people that come from a different place to whatever place you or I come from. So that is what the feature is about. I'm now delighted to kind of introduce our panellists who are going to speak for 8 minutes or so on these topics from their vantage points. First of all, to my left, Keiran Goddard, who's going to kick off. He's the Head of External Affairs at the UK's Association of Charitable Foundations. Over on my far right is Iona, Director of the Jo Cox Foundation, that was set up by the family and friends of Jo to take forward the causes close to her heart after her passing. On my right, nearest right here is Cathy, who is Director of Equalities and Human Rights, Equalities and Rights at the Lankelly Chase Foundation, one of the UK's most progressive and thoughtful charitable foundations. And on my far left over here, Sara. It's a pleasure to have Sara with us. She runs Inspire, which works on gender, human rights and anti-extremism work. And all of our panellists will be saying more about their work in the context of their comments. If I can just hand over to Keiran, who's going to speak from the perspective of a philanthropy infrastructure organisation. How infrastructure organisations can help foundations work on politically charged issues, and how can British foundations be more international in their focus if necessary. Welcome to all of you. Welcome, Keiran.
Thanks, Charles. Well, first, I think it's important to note quite how widely the concern about populism or political populism has been felt by UK funders. ACF membership maps, broadly speaking, onto the size, shape and funding focus of the sector more broadly. And what that gives us is a kind of helicopter view about how issues like this are felt, how they're experienced, and how they might ultimately be acted upon by the community. So just to reflect for a minute on why this is an issue that's been felt by so many funders with such seemingly disparate funding priorities. Firstly, I think it's important to note that populism doesn't really map onto traditional political axes, which is to say that it's not necessarily a left-right issue. It's probably best understood more as a political mechanism or a political approach, which means that it can be leveraged across the political spectrum. So from a funder perspective, populism has no fixed constituency. It can marshal the energies or the discontents of a wide range of individuals or communities, social alliances or beneficiary groups. And then there are the very obvious, very real and very justified concerns about the discourse that surrounds populism or the cultural noise. And the drivers for that are complex, obviously, and are nested in a broader historical context. But there are fixed patterns to it, and I think they're patterns that we all know. And those are things like economic precarity, perceived inequality, including localised inequality, shifting job markets, and at least a felt concern about the impact of globalisation. And then underpinning that, you've got the socio-cultural drivers, which again we all know, but they're things like immigration or questions of national, community, individual identity. And those things collectively, I think, drive the sort of toxic myth-making that comes along with populism, on which some foundations are rightly asking, in the construction of the demos or the everyman on whose behalf populism claims to speak, who gets included and who gets excluded? What space is there for historically marginalised voices and peoples in this kind of simplistic, almost cartoonish version of like nationhood or cultural identity? All of which is to say that populism as a concept is nebulous enough to offer multiple entry points for foundations, meaning that as well as being deep, the foundation engagement is peculiarly wide-ranging. And what does that mean for infrastructure bodies, given the depth of that engagement? Well, I think there's a number of things we can do. The first is I think we have a role in helping funders to navigate this kind of complexity. ACF has a long history of holding, curating high-trust environments, and that's the space in which difficult but necessary conversations can happen. And importantly, I think that they can happen amongst peers. There's a role for research, there's a role for policy and thought leadership, again in helping funders navigate perhaps the legislative or practical implications for their work. And I mean, this might be a stretch, but I'm not exactly sure it is a stretch. I think a clear commitment to robust evidence is also symbolically important during times like this, in a political climate where simplistic or sometimes outright counterfactual discourse is allowed to flourish so readily. I think we have a role, and we have to take it, in speaking up for the values of philanthropy and for the culture of giving. I think we need to amplify the achievements of the sector and help others learn from their long-term time horizon. So ACF has members, for example, who funded through conflicts in the Middle Ages or the French Revolution, which is leaving aside the rich contemporary history of funding conflict resolution or bridge building or community healing in places like Northern Ireland. I think maybe particularly for smaller organisations, infrastructure, speaking to what you said, Charles, has a role to play in linking people with continental and international practice as well. I think that's important for peer exchange and also to drive practice, but importantly to show solidarity, and it's solidarity at a time which is probably more accurately defined by its insularity than its solidarity. So ACF, we've recently seen or hosted delegations from Canada, Japan, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Finland, and in all of those meetings one thing comes up again and again and again within minutes, which is how are funders dealing with Brexit. And on that, and lastly, I think infrastructure bodies have a slightly more abstract role to play in helping to construct and share a kind of synthesised language around complex issues. So post-Brexit, or more accurately post the EU referendum, ACF began talking to funders about applying a Brexit lens to their decision making and using that lens to ask whether they were healing or inadvertently exacerbating divides along cultural, geographic or even generational lines. And in the months that have followed, we've heard that phrase, this Brexit lens, come back to us again and again and again. So we can only conclude that in some way that's a useful heuristic for the community. So in short, populism, an issue profoundly and widely felt by funders, and a real role for organisations like ACF in offering space, in offering structures of trust, varieties of outlook, synthesis, and an international perspective, which, as ever, we hope can support funders in their thinking and also in being genuinely ambitious in their practice.
Thank you very much, Keiran, for those opening comments and for situating these debates within the context of foundations and philanthropy. And how interesting is it to hear ACF in London hosting delegations of foundation communities from all those different countries, something that I don't know if happened to that extent in years past, but it's great to see it happening now. We'll come back to that in the context of Europe in a moment, but thank you very much. And I'd like to turn now to Iona Lawrence, who's going to talk a bit about what the Joe Cox Foundation has been doing, and what it plans to do next, and what you've been kind of experiencing through the experience. So welcome. And
Thank you. So, brilliant introduction to populism from Keiran. I'm going to talk a bit about how we've taken some of those trends and tested them in terms of kind of community solutions and responses to the rise of populism and extremism, as one of the projects that the kind of Joe Cox Foundation has been working on in the last year or so. So at the time, at this stage, obviously, as Keiran touched on, there is hugely unprecedented challenges and changes going on, whether it's the rise of extremism, both in the far left and the far right, or even more broadly, human rights, threats to the environment. The sort of focus of today's conversation on populism, I believe, needs to be responded to by philanthropists, by campaigners, and anyone who's sort of approaching to change things, with a view to forging sort of relationships and ways to bring different agendas and groups together. And it's only through building these coalitions of unusual actors, be them philanthropic and sort of funder and fundee, or institutions and organisations. There are lots of different ways you can forge new alliances, and it's this that underpins the approach of the Joe Cox Foundation, which, as you'll be unsurprised to hear, takes this entire approach. So no wonder I'm advocating for it. And in the sort of spirit of Joe, it's fairly unorthodox. So I actually sat down with Charles sort of last October and was like, so we're thinking about doing a foundation that doesn't really disperse grants. He was like, talk me through that. So basically we operate off at this stage of a theory that there's a huge amount of goodwill, both within Joe's family and friends, but also more broadly in her networks of ex-colleagues, and also thousands of people that never met her. And that what unites them is a sort of shock and horror at the tragedy of Jo's death, a kind of empathy with her values, and ultimately a commitment, an action-focused commitment to be part of building a legacy. And so what the foundation does is we are only 2 members of staff, and we play a behind-the-scenes facilitating and enabling role across these networks to continue the work that Jo was doing on the stuff that she cared most about when she died. And true to form, Jo cared about a huge range of things. So the vast array of things that we work on isn't necessarily, traditionally speaking, strategic. So what binds the Syrian conflict and protection of civilians in conflict around the world with loneliness is very little more than Jo's empathy for it, and that also these are places where there are big gaps in terms of the response, particularly the campaigning response to the problems, and therefore what we're seeking to do at the foundation is build coalitions of individuals and organisations to tackle the problems that Jo first identified and that her friends are continuing. So the sort of way I'll talk through our model a bit is with the Great Get Together, which was the initiative that we did to mark the anniversary of Jo's murder. So at about Christmas, we sat down with the family and we were like, what we're going to do to mark this, and as had been done at the moment of Jo's death, it was very much a moment for the family to say that they wanted it to be marked by positivity, by just a pure Jo energy. So for anyone here who met her or knew her, you would know that she would not want minutes of silence and wreaths being laid. She was not that sort of a woman, and to remember her was to remember her vibrancy and her spirit, combined with the fact that obviously the hatred and the division that had served to kill her, the act of hate that had served to divide communities and murdering her, was desired by the family to be overcome by bringing communities together, by bridging divides, and by overcoming that hate with unity. So in that vein, Brendan, who's done work for a number of years, Brendan, her widow, has done work for a number of years on this, has, in very brief terms, and I'm butchering his highly intelligent and well thought through research by saying that what binds the far left and the far right is this sense of community. So you don't start from a point of diversity or tolerance, you start from community and use a language of community. And so that's what shaped the Great Get Together, and the proposition was very simple, that from street parties to breakings of fast, because it happened during Ramadan, to barbecues, to just having a cup of tea with your neighbours. This was a weekend to come together with your neighbours and celebrate, as Jo had said in her maiden speech, that we have more in common than that which divides us. But with only 2 of us in the centre of the foundation, and not being community mobilisation experts ourselves, we decided that we needed to go to all of the big household names to reach out to people up and down the country and for them to do the hard work, basically. So we started in January by going to everyone from the Women's Institute to the Royal British Legion, and I've worked with Brendan and Jo for the past sort of 8 years building coalitions of every different shape and size, from things influencing the G8 on hunger campaigns to focusing on the refugee crisis in Europe. And I have never had the response to a coalition proposition like I have with this one. Usually, when you build a coalition of NGOs, you pull up a great big wish list and you expect that 1 in every 10 might be remotely interested in getting involved. And this one was one where I had a 100% success rate, which is not down to my ability to build coalitions, but more that we were tapping into something, providing organisations with a proposition that they knew would work with their membership, but also that was tapping into this desire for togetherness. So before I get on to more about why I think it was such a success, the Great Get Together brought together, as I say, everyone from the Women's Institute to the Royal British Legion to the big faith groups to Hope Not Hate. We brought all of the household names together, and by the 17th, 18th of June, 120,000 events were held up and down the country, with everything from Sadiq Khan hosting something for thousands of people in the Olympic Park through to a scarecrow festival in Maidenhead, which was the one that I went to on Saturday afternoon. It was lovely. So there was scale, undoubtedly, and to Keiran's point about narrative, that's what we were trying to achieve with the scale, was could we create this sense of of overcoming the kind of pervasive narrative about populists being more or extremists being more numerous than they actually are, and their sentiments being more widely held than they are. And in achieving the scale that we achieved in some way with the wall-to-wall media coverage that we got from the red tops to the broadsheets, something akin to this moment of reflection. And I think probably one of my proudest moments was opening the Sun and there being a double-page spread a week before the great get-together that started with Joe's More in Common quote and finished with, I think it was Nadia Hussain from the Great British Bake Off giving everyone a recipe for a cake. And I thought that is a level of engagement from that particular newspaper that I never thought we'd see in a certain type of shifting narrative. And it's not the whole win, obviously, but it was a moment of like, wow, we've really achieved something here. So, in terms of the numbers, we're undertaking a big survey of all the participants, but initially things are looking good. So, 83% of people who attended a great get-together met someone they didn't know previously in their neighbourhood. 46% of the organisers, so the people who organised events, hadn't previously organised an event, which is an incredible activation rate, and 77% of people who took part felt more hopeful about the future of the country as a result of the weekend. So that's all good stuff in terms of responding to the kind of challenges that which Keiran kicked off with at the beginning. And as I said earlier, the success I think is based in two parts. And number one, there is certainly a context thing, which is that we launched in February, and by the time we got to June, we'd passed through the tragedies of the London and Manchester terrorist attacks and the horrors of the Grenfell Tower. And what we saw at each of those moments, aside from the tragedy, was the community response to each of those tragedies. And I think what the Great Get-Together very brilliantly capitalised on, just by virtue of timing and having a very simple proposition, was the appetite for that communities coming together thing. And so there was certainly a context thing, along with a huge amount of sunshine over the weekend itself, which obviously helped big time. But also there's the strategic approach, and I'll bring us back to where we started, which is around, we had a proposition that was both for partners and organisations who were going to come on board and pitch it to their members and mobilise the best of their resources behind it. This was a proposition, 70% of whom the partners have subsequently told us it felt like a very natural fit. So when we said this is what we're thinking about doing, they were like, this is in line with our values, it's in line with our messaging, and we can totally fit it into our existing plans for this year, even though we're only about 4 months out. And then also, obviously, there was something in the way in which we'd created a central bank of assets and messages, and people and organisations were empowered to go off and deliver them. We had a very small team at the centre, and therefore there was no chance of us trying to be overbearing or dictating in the way that we ran this coalition. So, Charles and I were just talking outside, and I would be very interested to have a conversation, or maybe we should just do an initial hands up, because interestingly, in our thinking about what comes next, do we repeat the Great Get-Together kind of carbon copy next year, or do we try and do something slightly different? Certainly, there is. We're going to continue to engage in this space. How do we unite communities, and because stronger communities are more resilient communities, and they are more able to face up to change. But what does that sustained community engagement look like? Is there a need for a national day of community like we were talking about in France? Or do you need to seek smaller, more micro, transformational experiences that are much more micro in their approach, but that the user experience is much more sort of tailored, I suppose. So that's the big sort of strategic question at the moment. And with 96% of respondents to a survey of the participants in the Great Get-Together saying that they want to do something like this again, there feels like there's an overwhelming need for it to happen again, but what that looks like is still to be continued, because interestingly, even some of the partners have said, don't try and do it again in the same way, lots of different ways. Anyway, at the moment, our current thinking is, and it's very early, is that we would want to maybe try and create this sort of common good concept. So for anyone who's worked in the climate movement, you'll know that they mobilise these big sort of mobilisation moments that are unbranded and very low barrier to entry for all agendas and stakeholders with a remote interest in climate, although they will disagree on lots of different things, united in the need for a kind of step change in the response to the climate problem, and therefore they will create these moments of sort of like good where people will come together under this sort of big umbrella and they buy into a wrapper but they don't buy into a kind of core set of messages. And we're thinking about how do we create that with this, because we think that that is what is going to be the most sustainable in 10 to 15 years time. How are we going to have helped rebuild some of that social fabric that is needed in order for closer, safer communities? So what this leaves the foundation with is actually this is just one bit of a number of projects that we're overseeing that we're applying this model of coalition networked leadership to. And I'd like to leave you probably all with a request, because what we're going to do in the next year, for instance, is Jo is a big feminist, and we are going to be part of the kind of big nationwide celebrations of the 100 years since the women's suffrage, but also what does that mean for where we are right now and women's representation, not just in elected office, but in public life generally. And we're seeking to bring together all of the different women's actors and spaces to create something, hopefully, I'm not going to say what it is, but I think it's quite exciting. So yeah, there are lots of different ways that we're going to apply this model across different things, but I think for the people in this room, what I'd like to leave you with in terms of what I've experienced in the last year and what I've learned in the last year is that that for those of you who are seeking funding and those of you who are looking to fund, it's initiatives that exert solidarity in terms of shared resources and influence in the pursuit of change that are the most powerful. So that if I've learned anything, as I say, from the Great Get Together, it's to channel Jo's ability to just ask people for favours and ask organisations to come together with a view to bringing the best and the biggest brains around the table, because it's only with that, and it's not just solidarity, it's an approach, it's a coming together around a single issue in solidarity, but with an approach that is very focused on action and can do, that I believe that we can overcome the biggest challenges, including populism.
Thank you, and thank you, Iona. I wrote in my editorial about Brendan Cox's remarkable optimism and passion, but I think you can see it very much in everything that Iona said, and it's really exciting to hear about your plans. And just one challenge for you is if you had a double page spread in the Sun this year, a double page spread in the Daily Mail endorsing feminism next year, then we'll have you back. So, but you know, despite that optimism, which is reflected on the pages of Alliance, there are also challenges, and there are people that do want to divide us, and while they are marginal, they do exist, and there's that dark side as well. And on that note, for our last two speakers and comments, I'm going to turn to Sara now from Inspire to add her perspective in the context of the work she's doing.
Thank you, Charles. I spent around 25 years working within Muslim communities, 10 of which has been as director of Inspire. And I think today, in these turbulent times, I want to share some home truths about Islamist extreme populism in the UK. And I'll begin by saying our country has failed, and in particular, civil society has failed to tackle the populism of Islamist-inspired extremism. And as you can probably tell, I have no intention of being politically correct this morning. I have seen how a culture of political correctness and a disproportionate fear of causing offence has caused untold damage to Muslims and Muslim families in particular, to community cohesion, to human rights and women's rights in this country, and has also, of course, resulted in acts of violence, death and widespread terrorism, unfortunately. And our tolerance to intolerance has allowed Islamist extremism to flourish in our country for decades with very little pushback from civil society. Adding to the situation is our society's lack of understanding of the difference between Islamist extremism and Islam. The former is a 20th century political and puritanical ideology which opposes the nation-state, secularism, human rights, and is deeply anti-Western. It despises women's rights, gay rights, minority rights, is supremacist in ideology, and seeks to establish a caliphate. It also hates Muslims who don't subscribe to their fundamentalist worldview, so Muslims like me are declared as apostates. It is a far-right ideology, and it differs to Islam, a 1400-year-old faith which embraces diversity, culture, inclusivity, and promotes a moderate path. nor does our country have a good understanding of the diversity amongst British Muslims. We show little awareness of competing trends, for example, a very positive and emerging trend, but also a deeply worrying negative trend. But instead, we keep talking about a monolithical and mythical Muslim community, as if Muslims form a homogenous and singular bloc. So to view Muslims in this way, to not understand the difference between Islamist extremism and Islam, it's not surprising how political correctness and fear of causing offence is the order of the day. But our ignorance of the vastly complex picture that lies before us does not serve our cause. And it's why anti-racist and human rights groups today, despite campaigning, challenging and speaking out against far-right extremism, have remained silent on far-right Islamist extremism. And we are clearly living in an era of extremism. We've seen a rise of far-right extremism, but also an explosion of Islamist-inspired extremism, particularly since the latter part of the 20th century. And both feed off each other, both promote an us versus them narrative. In fact, when one analyses both movements, they are mirror images to each other in terms of ideas and methodologies. And yet, while our anti-racist groups tackle one, they refuse to tackle the other. Whereas still some anti-racist groups are working with, supporting and partnering with Islamist groups, demonstrating the unholy alliance between hard-left groups and far-right Islamists. So as a consequence, these extremist groups have had an uncontested space in promoting their hate-filled message for decades. They preach on our campuses, communities, in some cases mosques, on social media, on satellite channels, spreading their hate-filled, supremacist, intolerant ideology, radicalising thousands, with very little pushback from society. And today we are now seeing the fruits of our inaction. 12 years ago, when the London bombings happened, we were shocked to learn that 4 British Muslims murdered 52 people on our streets. If somebody had given us a crystal ball and said, take a look in 12 years' time, we'd be shocked at what we are seeing today. And just to touch on some of these issues, the fact that 1,000 people have travelled or attempted to travel to Syria, many of them to join groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, including third-generation British Muslim school children, have had hundreds of convictions for Islamist-related offences between the period of 1998 and 2015. Those figures of 269 don't include the figures of men like Haroon Saeed, a 19-year-old man who on Monday was convicted for life for trying to blow up an Elton John concert and to attack people on Oxford Street. And these facts represent, depressingly, the tip of the iceberg. Online there are 54,000 searches each month in the UK alone for extremist material. Teenagers and children as young as 10 have been declaring their support for ISIS. The generation we assumed who would become the most integrated, this is clearly not happening. In some cases, the authorities have had to deal with parents who've been found guilty of radicalising their own children. The rise and ramification of Islamist extremism cannot be solely viewed through the prism of terrorism. The damage is multi-pronged, socially, politically, culturally. It has destroyed Muslim families by having children who've become radicalised. It has fed widespread anti-Muslim prejudice. It has bolstered the appeal of populist leaders across Europe, in particular far-right parties, in justifying anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim rhetoric and policies. The political left, in contrast, have retreated, unable to explain or deal with the rise of Islamist extremism, having unwittingly provided a void for far-right populists to take a full advantage, with an electorate consumed by fear of Islamist terrorism. And very few often acknowledge it, but there's also been a rise in intra-anti-Muslim hatred. Anti-Muslim hatred directed at Muslims by other Muslims. Last year we saw the brutal killing of Ahmadiyya Muslim Asad Shah by Tanveer Ahmed for what was really in fact de facto blasphemy. And Muhammad Saidi, a 21-year-old ISIS supporter from Rochdale, who murdered 71-year-old Imam Jalal al-Din for being a Sufi Muslim. Women's rights have increasingly come under attack in this country. The practice of gender segregation has increasingly become more widespread. The demand for modesty clothing, particularly in the education sector, and the preaching that women's role is in the home in an attempt to deny women access to the public sphere. Just to take one example of a young 17-year-old Muslim girl who on a normal Saturday morning, while shopping with her friends, took part in a dance in a Birmingham High Street, which was filmed and uploaded, to this young girl to then find herself being barraged by abuse and death threats by British Muslim extremists for allegedly bringing shame on her religion. This was only back in February this year. This poor girl was in deep distress. She also had mental health issues. That did not stop one religious fundamentalist interview her and force her to apologise in a YouTube video. Did she receive any solidarity from our civil society? No, she didn't. I love our country. I believe our country is one of the best. I think we have made huge inroads since the end of the 20th century, particularly in race relations and so forth. But welcome to Britain of 2017, a Britain where Muslims like me will experience not only anti-Muslim hatred from the far right, but anti-Muslim hatred from the far left, and anti-Muslim hatred, abuse and death threats from Islamist extremists. We pat ourselves on the back thinking Britain has a great anti-racist, anti-hate movement, but in my view, the anti-racist, anti-hate movement is outdated and blinkered. It thinks hatred only comes from white folk and from those on the far right. Our society only talks about the anti-Muslim hatred I know the Muslims experience if it comes from the far right. It remains oblivious or deliberately chooses to ignore the wider and more complex picture. Those on the left promote anti-Muslim hatred towards Muslims in the very name of Islamophobia because of some confused notion about identity politics. Some Muslim groups who claim to be countering Islamophobia promote anti-Semitism or homophobia, and their concern is not human rights or tackling hate, it's forwarding the interests of Muslims and their Islamist anti-Western agenda only. The truth of the matter is that we do not have an anti-extremism, anti-racist, anti-hate movement fit for purpose in the 21st century. If we did, it would mean we'd challenge all forms of hate, wherever it emanates from, but we don't. If we did, it would mean we'd defend and protect human rights, whoever assaulted them, but we don't. And let's be very clear, extremists of all persuasions are bound together by a common hostility to human rights. I just want to end by sharing some particular points in relation to funders and philanthropists. I have realised that if I stand up and say I want to do work to challenge Islamophobia, I will receive substantial funding. This is not the case if I stand up and say I want to challenge Islamist extremism. On the contrary, some funders over the years have told me they feared they would be accused of being Islamophobic if they funded such vital work. Other funders find this work just too risky, but there are inevitably consequences to this risk-averse approach if we choose not to engage bravely in this vital work, and we're already seeing some of that cost. Most progressive countering extremism and human rights Muslim groups lack resources and funding. I know most of them in this country, and the overwhelming are often operating on a shoestring, in particular those groups led by women. In contrast, Islamist extreme groups in this country are well-funded, well-resourced and have more manpower. How can we win the battle against extremism if those on the front line are ill-equipped, they do not have the resources or the funding? If we want to challenge anti-Muslim hatred and Islamist-inspired hatred, we need to support Muslims and other groups who are on the front line doing this work every day, in solidarity. We have to understand better the politics and dynamics of countering extremism work, the extent of the problem, and whether our response adequately addresses the problem. I do not believe that at the moment this is the case, but equally, I do not believe it's difficult to have a sea change. I firmly feel we can change the situation around, and I wouldn't get up and do what I do each morning if that wasn't what I believed. But I do feel that we need to begin this process by speaking openly, honestly, addressing the elephant in the room, and to do so in the very name of solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sara, for those very thought-provoking questions, particularly about the confusion about people who want to fight racism, hate, some of the inconsistencies in the position, but also for raising questions about the roles that foundations can play. And we should come back to that in the discussion. But turning to one foundation and some of the work you're doing in relation to solidarity, perhaps in a slightly different area, I want to just hand over to Cathy from the Lankelly Foundation. Great to hear your perspective.
Thanks. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about what solidarity means to us, and in the way that we think and the way that we practice. And for those of you who don't know us, Lankelly Chase's focus is on changing the systems that perpetuate what we're calling severe and multiple disadvantage, so extreme marginalisation, people who are grappling with a variety of different problems in their lives at the same time, things like homelessness and substance misuse, mental ill health and domestic abuse. And actually solidarity is not really a word that we use very often. And in the run-up to this seminar, we were thinking collectively a bit about why that is, and I think it might be for us a kind of slight queasiness at being to suggest that we, with all our wealth, can be in solidarity with people who have very little power. When we were talking about it, we were thinking about it as a concept that's more commonly associated with people who are marginalised coming together. But actually, the concept of solidarity really is at the heart of the way that we think and the way that we try to be in the world. as an organisation, as a foundation, we've been on a real journey of change over the last 5 years. We're now at a point where we have a kind of working hypothesis about change, about systemic change and how it happens. And this, for us, is rooted in a series of values, really. We're calling them system behaviours. And these are the things that we think characterise healthy, functioning systems that work for everybody, including those who are most disadvantaged. And these system behaviours have come out of a long process of dialogue with lots of different people in the field around us, of observing, listening and learning, and largely actually in relationship with organisations that we've been funding. And so we now see our role at Lankelly Chase is about helping to try and create the conditions for people to want to, know how to, and be free to act in these ways in relation to severe and multiple disadvantage. And again, coming back to the idea of solidarity, top of our list of these 9 system behaviours is that people see themselves as part of an interconnected whole. And this comes from our systemic analysis, the sense that we're all part of a web of sort of unpredictable push and pull factors that affect all of us all the time. So it's about interdependence, but obviously ideas of solidarity flow very directly from that. And others of these 9 system behaviours, which really form our theory of change, speak to solidarity too. So they include things like that we want to see open, trusting relationships that enable effective dialogue. We want to see people being seen as resourceful and bringing strengths. We want to see power being shared and equality of voice being promoted. And I saw lots of these sentiments echoed in the magazine, actually. There were things like broadening the sense of us. That was one iteration that I particularly liked. Another was deconstructing otherness. And both of these are highly relevant when we're thinking about the most marginalised people. And so we think these system behaviours are relevant everywhere, up and down systems, and that we are all part of the system, and that philanthropy is very much part of the system that perpetuates multiple disadvantage. So they're everywhere, and that the practice on the ground that we are most enthusiastic and excited about is work that embodies these principles or system behaviours. It's an attitude of doing with and not to. So as seeing ourselves as part of this system, Lankelly Chase also thinks that we should be trying to embody these system behaviours in the way that we act, to model them. And also that in trying to effect change in a hugely complex environment, that the only way to be is sort of as profoundly open as we can be, and to bring a learning mindset to everything that we do. So we've been doing some work on our own practice, and I just wanted to share a few things of what it means for us to try and act in this way. Although I should say that we feel we're at the foothills of this mountain, and we are learning as we go, changing as we go. But this is kind of where we've got to so far. So one of the things we've been doing is investing a lot of time in relationships with the organisations that we support. And that often means explicitly working with them to design our working alliance. And this has meant, as far as possible, a conversation as equal partners about what the mutual benefits of working together are. And for us, it is about the learning. It's about the learning about how change happens in complex environments. And obviously, the money is there, the power is there, and that gets in the way sometimes. But it has felt genuinely as though if that is acknowledged, and if we invest in building relationships of trust, that really can be mitigated. We do a lot of core funding, and we're increasingly using a kind of mutually agreed set of questions, really, to structure a grant relationship. So one recent example, is with the Public Law Project, where we and they are interested in investigating or exploring the potential of strategic legal action for systemic change. So our piece of work is structured around that question rather than a particular outcome. So it's a process of learning together with them. We don't know what the end result is going to be, we don't know where we're going to get to, but we feel like we're on a journey with them. We've invested as a team in coaching training, and we're trying to take a coaching kind of approach with the organisations that we work with rather than an advising or an instructing kind of approach. We're certainly comfortable admitting that we don't have all the answers and that we're at the beginning of this journey. And we've also changed quite a lot of our internal processes. So we have devolved a lot of decision making. So the trustees have devolved decision making around grant spent to the executive. And we've also begun to use a particular methodology in our decision making and deliberating, which is designed to bring out all the voices at Lankelly Chase to make sure that everybody is genuinely heard and their contributions are valued, and that we air conflict and that the wisdom of the minority within our organisation is released. So these are all things that we're trying out, and it's all quite experimental, and there's undoubtedly further for us to go, because I'm not sure that we could really say that we've given up power yet. We haven't devolved any of the money decisions outside of the organisation, for example, but we're quite interested in experimenting with that. And I'm reminded of a John Adams quote, which I pinched actually from a Centre for Justice Innovation seminar this week, so you might have heard it already this week. But he said that power always thinks it has a good soul. So we'll have to see if we're really up for the challenge. But I think so. It feels like it. It feels like our trustees are up for it. We're also seeing really encouraging examples of solidarity between marginalised groups in our network of partners. And I think of Brendan Cox's article and this idea about the fragmented progressive agenda and the way that the far right has managed to, has a unified agenda. But some of the organisations we're working with are bringing together coalitions of marginalised people. So in Brighton, there's now an NFA, or No Fixed Abode Residents Association, which is bringing together gypsies and travellers, homeless people, students, to work on the issues that cut across those different groups. And one of our partners, Leeds Gate, is investigating the commonalities of experience between gypsies and travellers and women involved in prostitution and other marginalised groups of people in Leeds. And they're grappling with the real complexities of taking a leadership role. What does that mean in a coalition of people like that? But obviously, for us as funders, there's a step beyond funder solidarity with the organisations we're working with, which in a sense is quite easy. There's this much bigger question about how foundations and how philanthropy can make common cause with the most marginalised people, and whether we can in any way invite that or lead that. What does that mean? And I think, again, that our the system behaviours that I referred to at the beginning stand up quite well here as a kind of guide or an approach. So things like seeing ourselves as part of an interconnected whole, about open, trusting relationships which enable effective and difficult dialogue, people being viewed as resourceful and bringing strengths, sharing of power, equality of voice. But there are big questions about what that means in practice, and who we're talking about as well. And my colleague Alice, who is our lead on systems change, always reminds me that it's not just people with lived experience who feel powerless. Frontline workers and even commissioners, too, they feel that they lack agency and power to make change in this complex system that we're all working in. So perhaps I think it's less about aligning ourselves with one perspective and more about creating spaces for genuine exchanges, the kind of difficult conversations that you talked about, Sara, and more deliberative dialogue, in order to deconstruct stereotypes, break down otherness on all sides, to find common cause and to foster the strong human relationships that must be the foundation for action of any kind.
Thank you very much, Cathy, and thank you for that fascinating account of I've actually not heard such a clear kind of fusion of systems analysis and social justice perspectives coming together. And I think comparing that also with Iona's perspective, running a foundation in a very different kind of foundation, in a different way, and I think those two accounts together show the range of approaches that foundations can adopt if they're thoughtful about where they are and what their practice can be. And it's also good to connect with the wider questions around solidarity that you were raising, Sara and Keiran. So I feel we have two different conversations, one about processes of foundations and how they operate, and the other about externally, the issues they have to address. I'm planning, if it's okay with everyone here, to just continue the conversation for another 10 minutes or so, to about 10 past 10, which should give a chance for the wider discussion. So please do raise your hand if you have questions or comments. We have Celia at the back, and then...
This is maybe for Sara or Iona. We saw an incredible sense of solidarity and coming together after the Grenfell Tower disaster, where there was an incredible outpouring, communities coming together, etc. And that wonderful sense of solidarity was covered by the media for such a fraction of a second before quickly turning to blame and who put the cladding and. I wonder what role do the media have and what influence can foundations put to the media to promote some of these great acts of solidarity, and where there is a positive story to share that sort of reinforces that we have more in common than we do have in different, how can we influence the media to push that positive message rather than always focusing on the negatives?
Thank you, and it's a gentleman here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Chair from Keller Forums. I'm really interested in an answer to Iona's question, because I think the building of communities, building of loving communities, is the way we all, whether we're in charities or foundations, should be working. And in my organisation, which is working on leadership, and the only way you can actually help build these communities is by having good leadership. And I think foundations should be thinking about how do they support the growth of good leadership. And there's very little around, whether you're talking about the world and whether you're talking about charities, that the leadership is appalling. And the dealing with people is appalling. And more of the foundation should think about supporting organisations that will improve leadership.
Thank you, Brian. And any other questions or comments? Perhaps someone from a foundation here that's listened to their peers' perspectives on their work, or if not, I'll turn these questions over to you. Would you like to start, Iona? Comment on either leadership or media?
Yeah, maybe the leadership question, which I think is very important. I think there's one experience that I'd like to share, which is that at the end of the Great Get Together weekend, we were all in a pub at about 11 p.m. We'd finished the final iftar. The final breakings of the fast that had happened, I think, that evening in Newham, and also up and down the country. There'd been one in Yorkshire and some in Batley and in Manchester and everywhere. And the news started coming in of the Finsbury Park attack, and it was, I think, personally, the proximity of what we tried to do that weekend and the story we tried to tell, with the hatred that sort of drove that yet another kind of attack like that, was a really bitter pill to take. And like I say, it's not because we thought we'd solved the problem in a weekend, but because the proximity was very, very difficult. And so we all went home. I say we all, my team, we all went to bed, and I was like, right, we're not getting a lion tomorrow, we're getting up tomorrow morning. And we spent the following day reaching out to the communities that had organised great get-togethers in Finsbury Park, as well as actually at that stage we went to communities in Leeds and Manchester, because they reached out to us and said, are you doing anything? And by that evening we'd organised, for what turned out to be much more than we'd anticipated, hundreds of Londoners from across London coming together to lay flowers in sort of solidarity. And what we were trying to do there was, there was a leadership question, basically, which was that we reached out to community leaders at the Finsbury Park Mosque and the other communities around there, and we said, do you want our help? And they said, absolutely, let's work together. And in a pure 6 hours, we managed to locate enough people and flowers to do something that, to your question, the CCLA question, sort of provided a positive media story, but also one that matched the response to the London and Manchester thing. So in a roundabout way, what I'm trying to say is that yes, community leaders are there, and I believe that through sort of bringing people together and forging those alliances, it was only 24 hours later that we were harvesting those alliances and we were bringing those leaders back together again. And it wasn't us that did it, we provided some muscle, but it was definitely their leadership that had been nurtured over the weekend, and that sort of 24 hours later was being put into very good use. And I think that that's quite a good test case for what initiatives like the Great Get Together and other things can do in terms of bringing out those leaders, nurturing their talent, and then harvesting them at moments of kind of pressure further down the line.
Thank you. Sara and then Keiran.
Yeah, I think the media obviously has a huge responsibility to play, but to be fair to them, I think they've come leaps and bounds, say, over the last 10 to 15 years. I mean, I thought they actually quite a lot of good coverage about Grenfell Tower and the local communities coming together. It went on for a few days, actually, so I don't think it was a snap second. I think they did cover quite a lot. And even with the Finsbury mosque, the Finsbury Park attack as well, I remember the very next day they had, most of the press actually had the story of the hero Imam. Like 10, 15 years ago, the only person you'd ever see on the front cover wearing a thorn would be Abu Hamza or somebody, or always be very negative. So in that sense, I think it has shifted quite substantially. I think we've got to give credit to them. There's always going to be some tabloids who are always going to be a bit more problematic and help to kind of feed a culture of us versus them and the rest of it. We've got to keep pushing back against them. My main concern actually is social media now. Because nowadays we know that's where a lot of young people are going to get their news from. The concern around social media of how you can get into echo chambers, you're only hearing one type of story, you're not being challenged. And that's my main concern, because I can see how that's feeding young people, kind of a narrative where they're not wanting to have their views challenged. And that's concerning. I mean, after Grenfell Tower, I know extremists who went down to Grenfell Tower and hate preachers and who deliberately produced social media videos to promote an us versus them narrative. And I remember, I'm not going to name them, but certain groups who went down there and said, look, Britain has been burning and attacking and killing Muslims in Iraq, Afghanistan and so forth, and now they're burning Muslims in Grenfell Tower, and this is a deliberate attack and so forth. And those conspiracy theories, which were going around on social media, which thousands of Muslims were reading and believing, and I was speaking to young Muslims who were sharing that view to me. So despite all the, again, all the amazing work that Muslim organisations and others were doing in solidarity with other people, you've got groups out there who are deliberately trying to exploit situations like that in promoting hatred.